Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first panel of the conference on the future of experimental economics. I'm the organizer and moderator of the panel. So I'm an assistant professor of economics at Queen's University and one of the directors of Chile. We're very excited to have with us three panelists who have been incredibly influential in shaping the field of experimental economics, not just for their well-known papers, but also for pushing the field in terms of methodology. So I'm looking forward to a great discussion today. Gary Charness is a professor at UC Santa Barbara and the director of the Experimental and Behavioral Economics Laboratory at UCSB. He has published in many topics, including behavioral game theory, experimental labor economics, communication, contract design, field interventions, and individual decision-making. He's also a member of several editorial boards and a main editor at Games and Economic Behavior. Gary recently edited a very nice book with Mark Fingal on the art of experimental economics, 20 top papers reviewed, and organized a related panel on the art of experimental economics, past, present, and future at the last ESA North American meeting. Also, it's his birthday today. So happy birthday.
Thank you. Yeah, I turned 29.
Happy 29th birthday.
Thank you.
Okay, so Ricardo Perez-Truglia is an associate professor at the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. His research lies at the intersection of behavioral economics, political economy, and public economics. He won the 2020 Sloan Research Fellowship and is a co-editor at the Journal of Public Economics. Ricardo has run many field survey and lab experiments in the US, Argentina, and around the world to inform firms and policymakers on important policy discussions. Also, he's from Argentina. Lise Vesterlund is a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. She serves and has served on numerous editorial boards, including the American Economic Review, AEJ Economic Policy, the Journal of Public Economics, and the Journal of Economic Literature. Her research focuses on two distinct areas, charitable giving and gender differences in the labor market. And in both areas, she's written some very influential papers. Lisa has a new popular book coming out titled The No Club, Putting a Stop to Women's Dead-End Work, and coming out on May 3rd that I'm looking forward to reading. The way the panel will work is we will have a 1-hour Q&A. So I'm going to start with some prepared questions, and after that, we're going to take questions from the audience as well. So we have a Zoom meeting format, which means that you're able to raise your hands and unmute yourself and ask questions yourself. So I'm going to moderate by letting you know when it's your turn in case there's multiple people asking questions at the same time, or by reading the questions in case there are any questions in the chat. So I'll get started with my questions and you guys can start thinking of your questions. I'll start with an easy question as a warm-up before moving on to the harder ones. So the easy question is, this one is for assistant professors like me who are putting together their first PhD experimental economics classes. What is one thing you wish professors would teach in their experimental economics classes to future generations of experimental economists? And the order in which you guys appear on my screen is Lisa, Ricardo, and Gary, if that's okay with you guys.
You're the boss.
So does that mean you want me to go first, Karen?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll see if I switch in the middle.
So I think I don't think this is just for experimental economists, for any economist. The most important lesson is that just because an answer or question hasn't been examined doesn't mean you should be doing it. So, there are fortunately an infinite set of unanswered questions, but there's a reason why they haven't been answered. So be really critical of the questions that you're going to ask. And I think the advice for the main thing I wish experimental economists were taught is that the key part of what you're doing is the experimental design. That, I would say 3/4 of your time should be spent on the experimental design. Really thinking about that, sharing it with people, getting lots of feedback on it. So, and to be really careful in the lab, really think about the confounds and what are you going to do if you get this result? Can you really infer things from it? So the design component should be 3/4 of any experimental paper. And given that we all know how long it takes to write a paper, that means your design should really take a lot of time. So I think those are my main things. Questions should be something that moves the needle on knowledge, and you should try to answer it in a way so that nobody else has to wonder whether or not you came up with the right answer. So design, design, design. So those are the two things.
Okay, I can go next. I can tell you two things that I end up doing a lot of the time, that I spend a lot of time on, for which I have no formal training whatsoever from either my PhD studies or my college studies. The first one is doing qualitative interviews with subjects. So especially when it comes to field experiments, the way in which I started designing field experiments is like, okay, we have some economic models that they predict A or B, so I'm going to inform my research designs based on these economic models. And then the more I have doing this over the years, I realized that, well, economic models are useful as give you an interesting lens to organize your experimental design. What you should really be doing is talking to the actual subjects who are going to be part of the experiment. So what I did more and more of is, let's say we are running an experiment with employees of a particular firm, is okay, let's go to that firm, let's sit down with employees, invite them for a cup of coffee, show them the survey instrument, ask them, how will you react to this? How will you react to that? How do you feel about this and that? And a lot of the time that improved the recent design way more than any like prior economic model I ever read in the literature, just because, you know, there is a lot of nuance that you will miss if you are not paying attention to the real world. I'm pretty sure that sociologists get really good training at doing this. I have no formal training, so I'm just winging it. Maybe my advice would be, if you can take classes from the sociology department to other departments where they train you on how to communicate with subjects and how to quantify the responses and so on, that would be very useful. A related comment is that cognitive interviews are super useful when designing surveys. Again, if you go to the psychology departments, that we have lots of courses where they can train you for that. What I did is like try to teach myself, like reading books and stuff like that. But if I were able to go back in time, I would get like more formal training for that as well.
All right. Well, I'm considered to do a lot of work in psychology and economics. And like Ricardo, it seems that my strength in psychology is that I've never taken a psychology course. I did my learning about people by traveling around in the world for about 20 years. As some of you may know, I didn't go to graduate school until my 40s. So I go along with what Ricardo's saying, not necessarily to talk to individuals, but to get a feel of how people are. That's where my intuition has come from. I have a couple different things to say about this topic. So I certainly acknowledge that design is critical. And in reality, maybe you should spend 3/4 of your time on your design. Of course, you don't, because you have to write the paper, you have to be persuasive, you have to do the data analysis, then you have to do it 4 more times. But here's what I have to say. I think that what's important for students, at least for me, is to go with what your passions are. Go with your passions. Now, that won't necessarily give you what you need. So what I adopted more as a junior professor than necessarily as a graduate student, I started doing kind of a mix of things. I would do some papers that were kind of wilder and some papers that were more the usual type of paper. So I would take some chances on the wilder topics, and I would do some things that were more certain to actually come through. So I think it's normal for graduate students not to be so exploratory, and that's perfectly reasonable. One of my first experiments was based on a Ferris paper, and I pretty religiously followed what they did and just did some minor things because I wanted to stay near what was done. So I think it's useful to stay near what was done, but it's also useful. I think that if you're going to be a researcher, you need to have passion about your research. And otherwise, you're just kind of playing a game, and then when you get tenure, you just kind of quit. Well, I don't think that's a good way to go. I think it's better to go with your passions. Something else that I think might be useful for people in experimental classes is to learn how to write papers better. That's not supposed to be what we do. We're supposed to be researchers, but so much of what matters for the dissemination of your results is how well you can put them in a paper and how well that paper is received and circulated amongst the population. I happen to believe that writing is very important. I think that because I think it's my only real skill. So I think it's important. One thing you can do, and I do in some of my classes, is to have people write referee reports. Another thing I do is I have people write introductions. I take a paper, an existing paper, usually one of mine, and I give everything in the paper, but I don't put in the introduction. I take that out. I say, here's the paper, here's even the summary at the end. Write an introduction. It's not easy. It's really not easy. But I think the more practice you give people on writing, the better off they're going to be if and when they get to the point of actually writing papers. What else would I say in experimental classes? No, I would reiterate the design. Oh, one other thing I would say, and this happened to me. I had a project that I did early on as my first paper outside my dissertation was an idea given to me by Matthew Rabin on Ullmann's conjecture. And after I did the first set of treatments, I learned that there had been another paper written that was supposedly on the same topic. And if I had known that that paper existed, I wouldn't have written a paper, but I did. And it turns out my paper was, well, surprise, I'm telling the story. My paper was better, more well-received, actually came out earlier than the other paper. And what I have to say from that, I've had other instances where I was working with someone, we find out later that someone did something similar. Don't worry about that stuff. If something interests you, just go ahead and do it. Just do it. If you find out that other work has been done in the area, well, it won't turn out to be exactly the same. It never is exactly the same. So that's sort of the same topic as go with your passions, but don't worry too much about what's out there. And another thing, so I remember when I was a graduate student at Berkeley 1,000 years ago, that there were some people that were really, really very smart, and they had great questions and seminars and so on, and they never, ever produced any research. What did they do? They read papers and they read papers and they read papers. They never did anything. Don't just read papers. I don't actually think it's that useful to read papers. True confession, I don't really read papers, except when I'm an editor or a reviewer. I learn about them, but I don't worry about what's been done when I want to do a project. And maybe that's not a good idea, but if you're excited about something, I think that's the way to go. And now I'll stop.
Thanks for the great advice, everyone. That's going in my syllabus. The next question is, recent papers, one by Guillaume Frechette, Kim Sarnoff, and Liat Yariv, and one by Nikos Nikiforakis and Robert Slonim, have documented a significant decline in the fraction of experimental papers, especially papers with lab experiments, published in top 5 journals in the last decade, even though their impact, measured by citations, has exceeded those of papers in other fields. I think there's been a similar but smaller decline in field experiments as well. So can you talk a bit about this trend? What do you think are the causes, and what can researchers and journal editors do? So we'll go in a different order this time. We'll go Ricardo, Gary, and Lise. That's okay with you guys?
Yeah, sure. So I don't have much to say about it. My main take is that lab experiments were the pioneers, and for that reason, they should get as much credit as field experiments for all of the discoveries that we have in the field of field experiments. Everything evolves in life, even the COVID virus. It went from Delta to Omicron and so on and so forth. So I feel that as long as the profession embraces experiment more general and is legitimate and it drives a lot of the innovation in our profession, that's great. Whether, the fraction of lab experiments or field experiment goes up or down in particular years, my best guess is that if you zoom into a particular journal, you will have to do a lot about like who is the lead editor of the journal, what's the composition of the co-editors and stuff like that. I couldn't like obsess too much about it. I think that in the medium to long term, the truth will prevail. And if experimental papers are really informative for the profession, they will have a high impact, regardless of whether the editors in like specific journals at this particular point in time think very highly or do not think highly at all of experimental papers.
Me next? Well, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. It was only 10 to 20 years ago, I was publishing a top 5 paper every year. Now I publish 0 top papers every year. Tastes change. I think basically tastes change, and that's pretty much the story. Although I will also say that some regions of the world are more receptive to this sort of research than others. I have, I think, a grand total of 9 top 5 publications. 8 of them were accepted by editors who lived in California. I don't think that's an accident. And I don't think it's because I'm in California and there's some sort of regional whatever. I think that different editors have different tastes. And from my point of view, unfortunately, the tastes of the editors have gone to this very technical, endless robustness check sort of philosophy where you have a lot of expertise and a lot of analysis, and you have about this much content. Now, I'm biased. I admit that I'm biased. There's no question about that. What can be done about it? I don't think there's a great deal that we can do about it. I mean, appoint different editors, appoint editors that are more open to it. I mean, I could say that if we're supposed to be a social science, why can't we use the scientific method? But nobody really wants to listen to that. So I don't really have a good idea. I think it's really tastes of the editors. I don't know how that will reverse. I expect that it will. Tastes do change, and I think that they'll change again. Maybe some of us will become editors and have something to do with that change.
Me next. You done, Gary?
Yeah.
Okay. I find it deeply concerning that we've seen this drop in experimental economics. You know, one of the fields that is really taking off is behavioral economics. Much of the foundation for behavioral economics came from what we were discovering in the lab.
And they disowned it.
And it is really unfortunate that we as a profession have suddenly put lab experiments out on the side. So I would be just as concerned if we suddenly stopped publishing theory papers. I really think we need to look at all these different fields as contributing to our understanding of the world and economics in general, and experimental economics is a central part of that. And unfortunately, I think the whole sort of external validity and concerns for lab experiments has really hurt the profession, and we have not been very good at communicating subsequently about why the concerns that were raised are not concerns that are as critical as they were presented. So I think it is a serious problem for economics in general, and I really hope that we, by writing better and stronger papers and working hard with the journals, manage to get our footing back at the journals. I think it is concerning that a number of journals that used to have experimental economists on the editorial boards no longer have experimental economists on the boards. That, you know, just like any other field would find that disturbing, we as experimental economists should find that deeply disturbing as well. So I think there are sort of two factors. Right now I'm just complaining about how we're being treated. I think our field also has changed. And, you know, when Gary and I were trained, I don't know how Ricardo is, but certainly when we were trained, we were trained just as economists, and we used experimental methods. You know, I was trained in public and labor, and experimental methods was just the technique that I used to answer my questions. So you entered the field talking and acting like any other economist who just happens to use experimental methods. I think we've seen a market shift where more and more students are being trained as experimental economists. And I think it results in a more insular profession where we're talking perhaps too much to one another rather than trying to address sort of large questions. And that goes back to sort of Gary's questions. We should be working on large problems and problems that we're passionate about. And, you know, so I think part of our problem is that we became too insular as well. So I see it as it's a problem we all need to work on. And I think one of the ways to work on it is to talk with the journalists, and another is to change the papers that we write so that they become of more general interest to other fields.
Great. Okay, for the next question, we'll go, so I'm just switching every time. So we'll go Gary. Yeah, Gary, Lisa, Ricardo this time. So the next question is, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a shift in lab experiments to experiments on online platforms such as MTurk or Prolific. In your own research, did you have to make this change? What are some things you learned about running online experiments? And when the pandemic is over, finally, one day, do you see yourself going back to in-person lab experiments?
I am not fond of online experiments. I have had some papers where they were done with Prolific, which is considered to be better than MTurk by what people say in terms of the quality of the subject pool. I don't have a good feeling about doing online experiments. What I hear from people, I have not done them. I don't do them. People have told me that it's just not as good, and I'm uncomfortable with it. I have a revision for a paper that I'm waiting until I can do it in person. It's something to do with creativity project, and there's a little nuance as to how far apart people are seated, and it's sort of important that it be in person. So I have no plans to do online experiments. I would do them if they were the only way that I could go, but I don't really think they're the same. The biggest problem I have with them, though, is the same issue I have with a lot of stuff in experimental, is I want comprehension. And I worry that online you don't get comprehension. When people are in person, and I have a room full of people I'm giving instructions, and I do hand-run experiments mostly in person, I will ask for questions. And if I don't get questions, I start calling on people in the audience and asking them things. And this provokes some comprehension, induces some comprehension. You can't really do that very well online. I've had experiments where I designed them to be online experiments, and then people didn't understand them because it was supposed to be instruction-free, and I had to actually go through them in the lab and give a lot more instructions. So I worry about comprehension with online experiments. I also worry that the environment is not the natural environment. That one can be argued, though, because you could say now that, so for example, I'm teaching negotiation class now, and you can say negotiation is an in-person activity, but these days with the web and with Zoom, maybe it's not. So it's not clear where the natural environment is. But I'm old. I still think the natural environment is in person. That's where I have my intuitions about people. I'm not sure about my intuitions online. So I'm an old school guy. I am not going to be fond of going to do these things online. That said, there are some experiments that if you need thousands of observations, you're not going to get them in the lab. So there's definitely a purpose for these, but I'm not really a fan. I'm a consumer of those experiments, but I wouldn't run them myself. If I stop talking for 2 seconds, I'm done.
So I'm an old person as well. So
no, you're not.
I was, Jim Andreoni, who you all know, trained me to do experimental studies, and he is about as careful as any experimental economist can possibly be. He treats his lab as if it was a chemistry lab. There's complete control at all times, and that is what I like, because I really want to make sure that whatever study I do, I can replicate. So I know what it looked like when people came in. I knew that they were paying attention, which is one of the big things that we're seeing online now, that the online studies are, the results are just a lot noisier. If I was given a choice, I would always be in the lab, because I feel like it's a very robust environment and the participants are paying attention. That being said, it's also a very costly environment to be in, because we're paying the participants a lot more. It takes a lot more effort to run the studies. The online experiments tend to be a lot simpler in design, because there's just a limit to how much you can do. I have used online experiments for replicating studies. So what's increasingly happening at certainly the top journals is that you're almost asked to replicate your own results. And on occasion, I have replicated my initial lab experiments online to show robustness and used it in that setting. What I have done during the pandemic, however, is to use my entire in-person lab online. So that I use the same participants, we use the exact same format, people check in the same way, they're run at the same session size, and so far those results have fully replicated anything that we do in the lab. So it's not to say to be honest, there are lots of interesting studies that are coming out from the online experiments. Sometimes I worry, because it is so easy to do online experiments, how many other studies were done before, how many different parameters, so I like the barrier of going into the lab, because it's costly and you commit once you go in. So I well, if I can be back in the lab in person, that's where I will be, but I have very much appreciated the experiments that have been done online as well. I just, worry a bit about the tension, the noise, and the robustness of the results. So certainly a number of early mechanical Turk experiments are now failing to replicate on mechanical Turk. And maybe it's because the population changed, but if we can get that larger shift in the population, then it gets a little concerning. So I agree, it definitely seems like prolific is where everybody is shifting. If I have my choice, I will be in the lab, but it's because I'm trained by an old cohort, so.
So I have two quick comments. The first one is I share some of the feelings by Lise and Gary, but I think I have mixed views in the sense that these are some things that could be improved from online experiments. So if we are worried about comprehension, then let's try to develop better tools to measure comprehension and try to filter subjects and so on and so forth. And so on and so forth. I think that some of these experiments that they're being run simultaneously in traditional labs and also online in parallel, trying to replicate the same instructions. If we do find over and over again, and we keep finding in the future that they replicate very well, then maybe we shouldn't be so concerned. But as Lise was saying, if there are some instances, some context, or for some type of experiments for which the online ones are not able to replicate the lab experiments, then I would say, okay, let's step down and try to rethink what we are doing with the online experiments. My second comment is that I personally, because I do not normally run lab experiments, tend to see, and I'm more on the field experiment side, tend to see the online samples as a complement rather than a substitute for the type of experiments that I do. Right. So normally with field experiments, it's very difficult to, for example, collect survey data. You are just sending letters or like doing some sort of interventions with hundreds of thousands of people, sending door-to-door surveyors or something like that to try to collect beliefs for all of those people. In most cases, it's impossible. It would cost like millions of dollars. So what I've done in my research, and I've recommended my graduate students and other researchers to do as well, is to try to use these online samples as a complement for the field experiments. Mm-hmm. So look, let's take an online sample, let's give them the same information that we give in the field experiment, but rather than measuring behavior, like for example, whether they pay their taxes or not, let's measure their beliefs. Let's see how they react to the information and so on. And it's not that the online sample is gonna tell me the truth, that I'm gonna trust like whatever happens online, but most often than not, the online sample gives me some complementary evidence. Like, oh, look, according to the online evidence, it looks like the mechanism that matters the most is mechanism A rather than mechanism B. So I try to see them as complements.
You guys can feel free to respond to each other. So I think Gary has a
Oh, yeah, I was going to say something. I'll put my hand down because it's annoying to watch it. So another thing you can do, so I was at a conference once in London, and this was behavioral insights, and they're doing planning all these interventions to see, and I made the push, and I think this is reasonable. So I don't really do much in the way of field experiments. I'm participants in the papers, but I don't really run them myself. It seems too hard to me. But I made this story up, which I think is right, that you can see experiments, much as what Ricardo was just saying, is kind of a wind tunnel. You can try something out without going into the greater field and see what actually might be working. Here's an example. I was consulting for a little while at Hewlett-Packard before Fiorina became the boss and cut everything. And they were concerned about an advertising policy, and they wanted to know what effect it would have. So what they could have done is they could have identified a market and introduced the policy in the market and spent a whole bunch of money and a lot of time and found it out. Instead, we designed lab experiments, and we found a couple of bugs. We actually found a couple of bugs. It was useful. So I do see labs, even if you don't think that lab experiments have a great deal of external validity, treatment effects should still be treatment effects. And if you get them in lab experiments, that should give you some more confidence that the intervention might be successful or not. So I think it's useful in that way too.
You guys have a follow-up question from the audience. So this is from Nuruddin Ikrimov. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. So the follow-up question is about online survey experiments. So I guess, what are your thoughts about online survey experiments? Do you find that the data quality is okay there, or?
It's a survey. The survey is a survey. I don't think it matters if it's in person. My belief is that it doesn't matter. because I do online surveys, so maybe it's just a convenient belief, but I don't see why it would matter for a survey. Maybe I'm just wrong, but I don't see that it matters.
I think the challenge is just that there are a number of people who are clicking through very quickly.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah.
you know, luckily, as Ricardo was saying, there's been, you know, a lot of development in how we make sure that people are paying attention, that they understand things. You know, I think if you build in, you know, I think the last online thing I did, we might have had 5 different attention checks.
Yeah.
And get rid of the people who, you know, if you tell them to, you know, click blue and they're clicking all the other colors, you know, there are lots of different ways to make sure that participants are paying attention. I've certainly used online things for a lot of survey things where oftentimes when you're, I think that's one of the things that is happening in experimental economics is that you don't just run an experiment, you have a lot of ancillary things. You know, you have survey data that sort of backs up your claims. But sort of going back to Gary's point, for me, doing the central thing in the lab and then checking for robustness, doing survey things on the side, doing all of that online, I think it's just, you know, just like we should be, you know, I'm not saying we should always use theory, but oftentimes theory really helps us understand what it is that we're seeing in the lab. It should all complement one another. You know, it's like we should be doing question-driven research where we're trying to answer a question, and we will use whatever tools it is that we need to come up with what is the correct answer to the question. And certainly, I think using you know, online platforms for surveys that have lots of attention checks is a great way of doing it. Just like I think it's a great way to do simple experiments as long as you have lots of attention checks.
You can do them on Qualtrics. You can do it using Qualtrics. Oh, here's another thing that people have been doing, and it's kind of cool. So you can actually do it. You can't do big ones, but you can actually do an online experiment in person. So we have people, well, it's a long, ugly story. You don't want to hear the story, but my students have been doing things like using Otree, which is online, and actually being in a classroom, and they're doing it online, but they're in person. So that makes you feel like they're paying more attention because you can see them and they can easily ask questions. So that's another way you might be able to go, is to put something online like Qualtrics, for example, and you can get pretty good mileage out of it. The only thing I worry about is comprehension. Lise talks about attention checks. That's great. I'm a little concerned that they don't really work very well, but in principle, they should be great.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a great discussion, especially with you guys responding to each other. So we talked about, I think we started talking about this a little bit, but the next question is about external validity. So field and lab experiments have come under criticisms of external validity. We don't know if treatment effects generalize horizontally to another environment or population or vertically to another scale. At the same time, the experimental approach allows us to learn about mediation and moderation effects. So why and how treatment works. What should we think about when designing or evaluating experiments to deal with external validity concerns?
I'm last.
So is it me first?
Oh, geez, who was first last time? I've just been kind of rotating.
It's Lisa's turn this time.
Okay. So I think this concern for external validity is exactly why lab experiments are doing so poorly in the general interest journals. And you know, it's exactly what Gary was saying before, is that what we're trying to do in the lab is to identify comparative statics. We're trying to identify treatment effects. Is one larger than the other? That's what we're looking for. Every single test that we do in the lab most of the testing that we do is non-parametric, precisely because we're just interested in the order. So interestingly, we don't have a lot of examples of comparative statics found in the lab, not translating to the field. In fact, I think they pretty much always translate. So the entire concern for external validity is, well, not the quantitative effect is externally valid. But we would never think that the quantitative effect should be externally valid. If we go into the lab to compare 2 different auction formats, and we find that one auction format generates, revenue that's 200% larger than another auction format. We wouldn't advise anybody in the field to use one auction format because it generates 200% more revenue. We would just tell them, if you don't have any other insights, I would recommend you go with the one that generates more revenue. But we wouldn't tell them that the 200% was going to have any, everything we do in the lab, it's stripped down to the bare bones. We're just trying to figure out, does the ball drop or does it rise? And that's the information we come out of the lab with. So I think, unfortunately, this concern for external validity has failed to focus on what it is that we hope to learn in the lab.
Right.
And somehow that concern hasn't been, frankly, a lot of the field experiments we do, it's not that many of them where we really think that the quantitative effect is externally valid to any other environment as well. So, if we look at charitable giving experiments, it would be hard to imagine that the quantitative effect that I get for one charity in one city in the winter necessarily translates to the response that I get for another charity in a different city in the summer. So it's the comparative statics. And of course, when we start talking about policy experiments where we're trying to come up with an actual policy intervention, those studies are much, much greater because we really care about the quantitative effect. But by and large, most of the studies that we do, what we're concerned about is the comparative static. And I think it is misplaced to be so worried about the external validity of the lab, because all we're trying to look for is the comparative statics, and those have been externally valid, certainly in every study that I've seen. So I don't know of studies where the comparative statics are not externally valid. So if I was in the field and I was trying to figure out what policy to put into place, and I had no other information that one particular auction method was better than another, I would find that extremely useful. I think this concern for external validity has been exaggerated. We have done a lot in the field to reduce concerns that the external validity of our comparative statics are not externally valid. So we have clearly described instructions. We try to really make sure that we only change one variable between treatments so that we can identify the causal impact. So, I think where we work very hard in the lab is that we have careful treatments that vary only the variable that we're trying to identify the cause of. And that's why I love lab experiments. So that's my pitch. Who's next? Is it Ricardo?
Ricardo's next.
I think I'm next. So one thing that I have to say that I think applies both to lab experiments and field experiments is that the way in which some people are critical of experimental when it comes to external validity seems to be in a very vague / uninformed way. There is normally this blanket statement, oh, but would this be the same if it was United States instead of Argentina, if it was like employees of a firm instead of graduate students in a lab. I think what we need to do, rather than responding to them in the same way, oh no, like lab experiments or field experiments are always valid, we should turn the tables around and try to make an insightful conversation out of this. So for example, when we analyze the data from our experiments, we often find heterogeneous effect. Sometimes some interventions are more effective for, let's say, women than men, or higher income populations versus lower income populations. So by construction, given that we have heterogeneous effects, you would expect that if you were to apply this same intervention in populations where the share of females is higher or the share of higher income population is higher, you would expect to have different effects. Right. If we are using economic theory to inform our research design, most likely economic theory will predict some heterogeneous effect. Think of diminishing marginal utility, diminishing marginal returns, economies of scale, like heterogeneous effects are all over the place when it comes to economic theory. So what we could do is we could say, look, according to our intuitions and our economic theory, we believe these are the reasons or these are the underlying mechanisms. And given these mechanisms, we expect that if you were to move to this other context, the effects may change in this direction. If you were to move to the other context, it will change in this direction, and so on and so forth. And I feel that once we start engaging in this type of conversations, the people who are doing this criticism as just a blanket statement without really thinking deeply about it, they will be in trouble, because now we are forcing them to say, okay, tell me exactly what's the mechanism that predicts that this is going to work in the lab, but it shouldn't work outside of the lab. Whereas if it is someone that is honestly asking a question, hey, I trust this, I would like to try it in the field, let's try to think whether it would be more effective in this context or other context, that's a conversation that will be very constructive and useful for them. So that would be my first advice. Like, rather than just waving away the problem and saying, no, let's not talk about external validity, let's try to like go head on and try to have an insightful conversation about external validity. The second thing that I want to say is that, especially when it comes to publications and referee reports and all of that, for some reason, there is the illusion that a paper should prove something. And in reality, a paper doesn't prove anything. Like, personally, I never believed a story or a finding or an effect ever begin with one paper. It's only one. There is another paper that replicates it and another one that does it in the field rather than in the lab. And then they look for a natural experiment that shows that, and so on and so forth. That's when I start to say, okay, there is something real here. So in that sense, we should think of lab experiments, for example, as the pioneers, the people who are sort of like, they start mining and they see some like evidence of gold, and then the field experimenters come again, and then after the people who do natural experiments and so on and so forth. I think if we take like the bird's eye view and we see not the paper, but the literature that will follow that paper, people will start to see a lot more value in the lab experiments. They should understand that you shouldn't trust this paper. You should trust that with some probability this paper is right, and there's going to be a whole literature trying to uncover this in a lot more detail.
So I'd like to echo the comments made by my two fellow panelists. I very much agree with what Lise was saying. And I agree with Ricardo entirely on this issue of exactly what are we talking about with external validity. So, for example, there's this paper by Falk and Heckman that came out in Science, I don't know, 12 years ago maybe. And it basically said, look, we're looking at treatment effects here, and you can't tell me that your theory doesn't apply to the situation. Theories don't come with labels saying when they apply and when they don't apply. So what is external validity here? I'm going to take a more cynical viewpoint now. I'm going to express it, and you guys may not like it, and you may not agree, but I'm going to say it anyway. There are a lot of tools that people use to do econometrics and estimation. The people who are the estimators have taken over the journals. They only like estimation. I could give you names. I won't bother to do that. And because it's what they do well, this is what they like to see, and they have taken over. I think that the concern about external validity is completely overblown. I don't think that people are actually being genuine when they make that criticism. I think it's an excuse that people are using. I think that my experiments are completely externally valid. I get treatment effects. They're always found in the field. It just never varies. How is that not externally valid? So I just think it's an excuse. I think it's that people have their tools and they want to further what they're good at because it furthers their careers. How do you stop that? That's a different question. But I don't think we really have this issue about external validity. And I think if we're able to do what Lise was talking about, and I will admit, I don't even try. I've never really tried. I do like talking to other experimentalists. But, you know, if we could communicate more successfully that they're using the wrong measure when they talk about external validity, that we're not talking about levels being realistic, we're talking about treatment effects being realistic, we might make more progress. But I do think that there's actually a bias out there that is preventing it. I don't think it's just it's a level playing field. And maybe that's wrong, but that is my view.
Can I just second Ricardo's comments also? So I think one of the ways that we're sort of protecting ourselves against external validity is that we have this wonderful tradition of replicating studies. You know, so if you think about my paper with Muriel, where we found gender differences in competition, that's the first paper, you know, and it's like the effects are large, but you don't get that result to be established in the literature until you get the many other studies that replicate that finding and take it into other settings and replicate the finding. And then start studying, you know, does it always happen? You know, what are the, but it is the body of literature that, and the number of studies that follow that create the findings. So I agree completely with Ricardo. And I think one of the ways that we are trying to sort of handle the concerns for external validity is that we share our programs, we share our you know, instructions, and we keep seeing the same results showing up over and over, so that eventually people can't just look at a result and say, yeah, but is it externally valid? Because ultimately we end up showing that it is. Right? So I think that's how we're trying to get at it.
Great. Okay, so we do have an order for the next one that is not so random, so giving a shout out to Julie, the research center that I'm part of the director's team of, that is organizing this conference. So with Julie, we're trying to encourage field experimental research in Argentina and other Latin American countries. So what are some opportunities and challenges of doing field experiments in these countries? And so this question, I guess, is mostly targeted to Ricardo, although if everyone else has you know, comments, obviously welcome to join. So.
Okay, I would love to take this one first. If Gary
All yours. All yours.
So there are pros and cons. I would say that the pros is that Argentina is a laboratory for natural experiments and for interesting policies, and they're always trying crazy things at a rate that no other country can match. So in that sense, there are lots of interesting things to study, that there is a lot of material to work with. So that's like a positive side. On the negative side, the problem is that Argentina tends to be a country which is politically quite unstable. There is a lot of political turnover. And the problem with that is that, and this has happened a lot to me, I've started probably at least 10 experiments in Argentina. I think I have ever published only one. The reason is the following. You start working with a government agency, they change the government, and then the people who like represent the new government, they don't even pick up the phone. And in some cases, I had some calls where I was accused of being neoliberal and like crazy things like that, just because I was, you know, working at the University of Berkeley, which I know it might sound like the craziest thing in the world, but they actually believe that because I was working in an American university, I had some secret agenda with the American empire or something like that. Yeah. So the one thing that I do when I work with some organizations in the United States is we always have some sort of data user agreement where we have a commitment. Okay, we're going to put a lot of resources. You are going to put a lot of resources. These are the goals of the research. You give us the right that we publish the results, whatever the results are. Sometimes the company may be, or the government may be happy with the results. Sometimes they won't. It's very important that they publish the results anyways, that we don't create any publication bias. But on top of that, there are lawyers who are making sure that, you know, because we signed this agreement, they are not just going to drop the ball and never give us data, or not, they won't pick up the phone and so on. So I think that the existence of GILAE is exactly what Argentina needs in order to promote field experiments. They need this sort of intermediary who is going to be, you know, talking to the researchers from other countries, but also talking to these organizations and making some sort of legal agreements, but it goes beyond the legal agreements. I think that the fact that, you know, the informal agreements are also very important. So having that intermediary that will help that whenever the government changes or something happens, the researchers will still be able to access the data or continue with the pilots and so on is absolutely essential. So I'm very happy that you guys have that initiative in Buenos Aires.
Can I just chime in, even though I probably shouldn't? But I think Ricardo's point on you know, taking advantage of the things that are different. Unfortunately, we're so focused on looking at things in the US, so you almost have to explain why you're looking someplace else, which should not be necessary because every place is interesting in of its own. But from a more realistic perspective, the studies that do get published from other countries tend to take advantage of unique settings in those countries. So for example, I had a paper with Marco Castillo and Reagan Petrie, where we ran a field experiment in Lima, Peru. And one of the wonderful things about Lima was that they had a completely competitive market for taxi drivers who, if you wanted to be a taxi driver, you could become a taxi driver. So I think the looking at unique policies, looking at unique markets, looking at unique settings that can give us insights that we wouldn't be able to get. And I'm not advising that this is the only way that we run experiments in other countries, but I think those are the studies that tend to be more successful because we're learning things that we couldn't just have done in the setting that we're in the US, which is unfortunate, but I think that is how it is.
Nothing to say.
I think if you guys have anything to add, you guys can go ahead and add it. Otherwise, it looks like it's time to maybe take some questions from the audience. Okay, so yeah, I don't want to take up the entire time because I want to let people speak up in the audience. So if you guys have any questions you guys would like to ask, just go ahead and raise your hand and I will figure out the order. If you guys don't have questions, I have more questions. So either way works for me.
Can we ask each other questions too?
Sure. Do you guys want to ask each other questions?
I haven't thought of any yet, but
you guys are part of the audience too, I guess.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, were you facing problems in publishing a project that were conducted outside of the United States? So sometimes it feels like the United States is the world, and if something was found in some small country, so what do we care? Why do we care about it? So I was wondering if you ever got this feeling, and if you did, then how do you overcome this?
I don't think that actually happens. Well, certainly outside the US and Europe, and it doesn't matter for Europe. So, sorry, Lisa?
I mean, I've also studies where I've used Danish register data, which has an amazing quality, but trying to publish a paper from Denmark, you have
really?
All kinds of, why would we be interested in Denmark?
Really?
It's only, it is, real human beings who live there and they have real institutions, but I've definitely run into, somehow you have to come up with an explanation. You have to show that they're similar to real people in the US.
Yes.
So I've certainly run into, I think if you, unfortunately, I think you often have to have an explanation for why you're not doing things in the US. At least that's what I've run into.
But if you run a lab experiment in somewhere like France or Germany, I don't think it faces any problems as opposed to running the same experiment in the US. I just don't think so, because so many of my experiments were run in Europe. Now, something with a register like you're talking about, I believe that that's probably true. But I think lab experiments are kind of immune to that. It's more the reputation of the authors, I think, than the place where they ran it. At least that's my own experience. I've never gotten that criticism on a lab experiment about the population.
I don't know, Yuval, maybe you were thinking of field experiments. I do share your feelings a little bit with field experiments. Every time that I run a field experiment outside of a developed world, it ends up with like 2 pages of a full section on external validity.
Yeah, I guess that's
explain the context super well and how it relates to the US and so on and so forth. I have never been asked to do that whenever the experiments in the US, like write 2 pages why the US is so different from China or from India or for the places that, by the way, have the most people. The US in the end has only 300 million people. So I do feel that there is a little bit of that. My feeling is that it changes a lot from field to field. There are some fields that are very developed country centric. Like I have a feeling that public finance, for example, and labor economics, they tend to put a lot of weight on whether your findings come from the developed world or not. In some cases, it may be like out of ignorance. Like most of these researchers, they work for the chair of economic advisors in the United States. They know exactly how the US institutions work. They have never been to Italy or to Argentina or to Vietnam and so on and so forth. So they truly don't know whether those contexts, are similar or not, on which ways they are different. I feel that given that now the diversity in the economic profession is going up by that much, that's going to help it on. I think that maybe 20 years from now, we will be asking researchers to say, hey, you know, there are only 300 million people in the United States. You know that the United States is weird in many ways, like everyone has a gun and this and that. Please explain why is that the rest of the world should care about this. So I hope that we're moving in that direction. We are a long way from that, but I do think that we are going to move in that direction.
Okay, we've got a question from Alejandro. You're next. And Gary, I don't know if you have to actually leave at 5 sharp.
I don't, unless you tell me I have to leave, I don't have to leave.
Oh, no, I thought you were teaching. So yeah.
No, I don't teach today. I teach Monday and Wednesday. I believe today is Thursday.
Oh, never mind. Okay. We're good.
Right.
Hello, super interesting the conversation. I have just a comment. I got the impression, I'm not familiar at all with lab experiments, but it seems to me that some of the questions that perhaps you study in lab experiments, the sign of the effect is probably obvious and you do care about the size of it. Is that the case, or is it always the case that in lab experiments, you just care about the comparative statics?
Mostly the second. I don't trust. I think I can change behavior sometimes if I wear a blue shirt or a red shirt. I mean, I don't trust the levels. I would never trust the levels. But other people may have different points of view. For me, it's all treatment effects.
And I don't think we study things where the comparative statics are obvious. You know, it's,
Okay.
you know, does it help if people give sequentially or simultaneously? I don't know. Does it vary when people have information about what they're giving to or not? You know, so I don't think it's true that we study it to figure out what the comparative statics are. And oftentimes the comparative statics are opposite of what the theory would predict, which is precisely where we're studying it in the lab, because it helps us understand what we missed in the theory. What was the simplifying assumption we had in the theory that was incorrect? So. But obviously there are times and there are certainly people who are there to look at levels. So, you know, if you're trying to elicit risk attitudes, if you're trying to elicit discount factors, you know, there are a different set of experimental economists who see those as revealing levels. So I think it's fair to say that there are others who have different opinions, but certainly the studies that Gary and I have done have been focused on the comparative statics.
That's fair.
Thank you.
We have a question from Sharia next.
So we see now like experiments are widely used in so many fields, like in labor development theory, like. So just curious, like, do you consider experimental economics as an independent field, or is it part of other fields?
I see experimental economics like econometrics. You know, it's a tool, and you can use it. It is not a separate field. It's a tool that we use. So I don't see it as a separate field. But just like the econometricians like to talk to one another about the latest estimation techniques, the experimental economists like to talk to one another as well. But I see it as a tool that should be used really in most fields, just like econometrics or theory.
Yeah, I would add to that in a sense, today experimental economics is a lot better integrated than econometrics. Like if you see what you need to publish in order to get tenure at the top university in econometrics, you have to publish pure math. No one of your colleagues in the econ department will ever understand what you're talking about. And this is not something that I'm saying. My colleagues who are econometricians tell me exactly this. They nowadays don't even publish in journals other than Econometrica. They publish in lots of mathematical journals, statistics, and so on. I think that experimental economics has been very successful in integrating very well. And when you talk to an experimental economics, normally they are very fluent in labor economics or behavioral economics or public finance or whatever topic they happen to be running experiments in. And that's a very good thing, at least in my opinion.
So in response to your question, I want to ask back, do you want to know what I think about it, whether it's a separate field, or what the mainstream of economics thinks about whether it's a separate field? I think, as Lisa said, it's much like econometrics. So if econometrics is a separate field, which I think it's considered to be, so would be experimental. But I will say that when I tried really hard to push to get an NBER thing for experimental, I was turned down cold by the guy who handles it at Harvard. And he just said, look, it's not a separate field, blah, blah, blah. So it is not given that respect out there in the economics profession. But I do think it's the same story as what Lisa said. It's, I don't know, if econometrics is a separate field, then experimental is the same thing. It's basically a tool. It's not, I wouldn't, I mean, strictly speaking, I guess I would say econometrics is not a separate field either. And then so experimental isn't. But if econometrics is, then why is not experimental?
So we're actually a little bit over time. So I think this has been a really great discussion. I've learned a lot. It's been super interesting. Thank you guys so much for coming and giving it this discussion.
Thank you, Karen, for organizing and for the great questions.
I've been in Buenos Aires since 1988. My first visit. I liked it better in person, though.
Yeah, you guys should come next year to the in-person ESA conference that we're organizing.
I had a great time in Buenos Aires in 1988.
We're thinking of doing tango social events.
Yeah.
This is an ad for everybody. So yeah, we're doing that next year. But first, tomorrow we have another great day of the ESA conference this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys there as well. So see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.